We are fortunate enough to get to hear from a lot of fascinating experts on this podcast. And if you're hungry for more, try learning from the world's best experts with Masterclass. Masterclass is the only streaming platform where you can learn and grow with over 200 of the world's best. For just $10 a month, an annual membership with Masterclass gets you unlimited access to every instructor. I'm a huge fan of the authors Roxane Gay and Margaret Atwood. And they both have masterclass offerings, one on writing for social change, that's Roxane Gay's masterclass, and Margaret Atwood has an incredible one for creative writers. I'm also just endlessly impressed by the level of talent that they have on there. There is no downside to signing up. Right now, our listeners get an additional 15% off any annual membership at masterclass.com/magical. That's 15% off at masterclass.com/magical. masterclass.com/magical. A quick message before we get into today's episode. I just wanted to humbly ask, nay, beg you listeners that if you like Magical Overthinkers and want to keep listening to it, that you'll consider taking 10 seconds or even a whole minute to leave 5 stars and a little nice sentiment about it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you're listening. I think Father Algorithm or whoever controls the podcast charts pays attention when a show is getting a lot of positive ratings. Rating the show 5 stars also lets me know that you're enjoying it, and that's really encouraging. And the only other thing I want to say before we get into today's episode is that I record most of these episodes of Magical Overthinkers in a beautiful studio. I'm in one right now. And we take video. We film all these episodes. So if you would like to listen with your eyes, if you would like to watch episodes of Magical Overthinkers, they are up on YouTube. Every single episode, every other week. You can find that YouTube link in our show notes. Okay, thank you for listening, and on to the episode. Welcome to the Magical Overthinkers podcast, a show for thought spiralers, exploring the subjects we can't stop overthinking about, from imposter syndrome to millennial cringe. If you ever get the feeling that despite living in the information age, the world only seems to be making less sense, or that for some mysterious reason, it just feels especially hard to exist as a human in the world right now, then you're in the right place. This podcast is here to help us think less about the things that don't matter and more about the things that do. I'm your host, Amanda Montell. Today, we're overthinking about toxins. I feel like this topic almost needs no introduction. It's hardly a stretch. This notion of thought spiraling over invisible, poisonous entities that lurk in our food and our clothes and in the air all around us that are probably killing us slowly, some of which are actually just made up by conspiracy theorists who might have political motivations, and others of which are very real but poorly understood or seldom discussed for reasons that can very well make a person quite paranoid. Discussions of toxins really are crazy-making. In fact, I was just on a trip with a friend, one of my more hypochondriacal friends, but anyway, it felt like every other hour something panic-inducing would come up, like forever chemicals in the sparkling water I wanted to buy, or lead in our favorite dark chocolate, or did you know that if you eat rice that's been left out overnight, it could poison you to death? Sometimes all of this confounding toxin terror is enough to make me want to throw up my hands and just say, I don't know what to believe. I don't know what's within my control. And we're all gonna die anyway. I could lead the most non-toxic life ever and get hit by a bus tomorrow, so I might as well enjoy my Topo Chico in the meantime, you know? But then I think, is that attitude just defeatist and self-sabotaging, irresponsible? It is just so hard to know what is going on and who to trust with regard to how our bodies are interacting with the environment in this ever-confusing technological age. I often just wish someone had the definitive answers to what I can actually do to limit my legitimate toxic exposure in a way that will allow me to live a healthier life and maybe prolong it without destroying my ability to enjoy it, psychologically and otherwise. Personally, whenever I get myself into a medical-themed thought spiral, I tend to seek solace from one particular person. And that person happens to be my mom, who is a cancer cell biologist and a cancer survivor herself, and also just generally really good at sifting through a glut of information on a topic, isolating the necessary nuggets of wisdom, and communicating them in a way that a ding-dong like me can understand. My mom is so comforting when it comes to overthinky thoughts about science and the body, and so I wanted to share some of her wisdom with all of you. I want to thank all of the listeners who submitted thought spirals for this episode. I could not have done it without you. So without further delay, I want to introduce my mom, Dr. Denise Montell, for a conversation on overthinking about toxins. Denise, Dr. Montell, mother, could you introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us a bit about your work?
Okay. Well, I'm Denise Montell, and I'm your mom. And I'm also a professor of molecular, cellular, and developmental biology at the University of California in Santa Barbara. I study cancer cell biology is how I describe it. I'm interested in how cells behave normally when they're going about their business, and then how they misbehave in diseases like cancer.
Yes. It's really just low stakes, unimportant work that will not lead to anything close to saving the planet. I'm just kidding. It is so useful to have a cancer expert mom. Well, I stretch your expertise whenever I have anything from like cramps to a pinched nerve. I like consult with you to make sure it's not cancer. Actually, though, I want to spring upon you a question that I did not supply ahead of time, okay?
Okay.
It is the question that I pose at the beginning of every Magical Overthinkers episode, and it goes like this. What is an irrational thought spiral that is currently living rent-free in your head?
I mean, honestly, I have been obsessing over the origin of life. I'm not reading books about it.
Relatable.
I know, not at all.
No, so for me, totally. I mean, okay. What? There's no better thing to obsess about.
I actually couldn't. Well, no, it's the most pointless thing to obsess about when you think about it.
The origin of life in the universe.
The origin of life on planet Earth.
On planet Earth. You don't care about like exoplanets.
No, well, I can't think about that.
Okay. How does that thought spiral manifest for you?
Well, I'm reading a book about it, but also...
What book?
The name of the book is Vital Question, Energy, Evolution, and the Origins of Complex Life by Nick Lane.
Okay.
So I really have been thinking a lot about the origin of life, and it's kind of irrational because it honestly doesn't matter.
Yeah. It's like thinking about free will. It's like,
yeah,
whatever.
No, like it doesn't matter, but it's so fascinating. And I've honestly never until now, until this book, come across even a plausible like scenario that could explain the very, very beginning of how something could go from non-living to living. And yeah, the answer is really cool.
All right, give us the Cliff Note version.
The Cliff Note version of the answer, and it's very involved biochemistry. It's too involved for me, but basically, well, most people are aware of these like deep hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean where like magma from the center of the Earth heats up. And some people like to think that life might have originated there, but actually those are, pretty hostile environments because of the extreme temperatures and pressures and so on. But there's another type of like calmer little hydrothermal place that's like not quite as overheated and it's alkaline. And there, the geochemistry is such that like this labyrinth of little mineral cells develops. And those can serve as the little crucibles for the origin of life because of the natural processes that he describes in great detail of like,
Sure.
And then the life has to escape that little mineral place by developing its own like lipid membrane or whatever.
And the earliest forms of life are little bacteria or whatever?
Well, I mean, before there's bacteria, there's got to be a protocell. Yes. So people call it affectionately Luca, the last universal common ancestor.
Luca.
Luca, yeah.
Why are you overthinking about this?
Well, I just find it fascinating, even though, like I said, it's fairly pointless, but it just, I don't know. I need to know.
You need to know.
I need to know.
I mean, it is the fundamental question. Why are we here? Why are we like this?
Yeah. Since I'm not religious, like this is where I go with that.
Yes. Yeah, this is the story of Eden. This is Genesis. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yep.
I get it. And you're digging so far deep. You know, some people, they go as deep as like, you know, who were my grandparents?
And I'm like, who was Luca?
Who was that first protocell? The protocell that unites us all. That's really beautiful. We are fortunate enough to get to hear from a lot of fascinating experts on this podcast. And if you're hungry for more, try learning from the world's best experts with Masterclass. Masterclass is the only streaming platform where you can learn and grow with over 200 of the world's best. They offer online courses for every interest and skill level, whether you're interested in learning career advice from someone like former Teen Vogue editor-in-chief and author Elaine Welteroth, or communication skills from former FBI lead hostage negotiator Chris Voss. It is truly amazing how many super practical or niche interests you can find on Masterclass. I'm a huge fan of the authors Roxane Gay and Margaret Atwood, and they both have Masterclass offerings. One on writing for social change, that's Roxane Gay's Masterclass, and Margaret Atwood has an incredible one for creative writers. For just $10 a month, an annual membership with Masterclass gets you unlimited access to every instructor. So if you're just a generally inquisitive, curious person, there's so much to choose from. Bill Nye the Science Guy has a Masterclass offering. There is no downside to signing up. Right now, our listeners get an additional 15% off any annual membership at masterclass.com/magical. That's 15% off at masterclass.com/magical. masterclass.com/magical. Okay, let's get into it. We're here overthinking about toxins and their connection to cancer, among other things. The questions that I'm going to be asking you today are almost entirely listener submitted, because the questions that we got on this subject, normally I would reserve them for the end of the interview, or I would pepper them in betwixt my own questions, but they were so thoughtful. And so many of them had so very much to do with your particular expertise, as it turns out. Thanks, everyone, for doing my job for me. But we're going to really dedicate this interview to these listener-submitted thought spirals. And the first one is very expositional. It is just simply, what are toxins? Is it an actual thing or a spectrum sort of deal?
Mm-hmm. I mean, we shouldn't overthink the word toxin. It is pretty much what it sounds like. You know, just in everyday language, these are substances that do harm to us. And some toxins, like a snake venom or a cyanide, might like sort of kill you instantly or really quickly. But other toxins operate more slowly. They do damage a little bit at a time. At different concentrations, they might do different amounts of damage. So from that point of view, it could be kind of seen as a spectrum. A particular substance at many different concentrations could cause different problems. But, you know, toxins are just things that are harmful. It's kind of a synonym for a poison.
Yeah. Well, I don't know for sure, but to me, it seems like one of the reasons why people might have the thought, is this real, is because the word toxic can be used so symbolically and metaphorically. Mm-hmm. Toxic relationships, toxic power dynamics, you know. And so when a word can apply to both the physical world and the emotional, psychological world, it can start to maybe, dare I say, poison the meaning of the physical sense.
Right. So when we're talking about toxins in the environment that might cause cancer, we're really talking about those physical chemicals and other compounds that, you know, substances that we're going to come across. And I think we're really sticking to the physical here and not the metaphysical or the metaphorical.
Yeah. And I think, too, like the term toxin has been so weaponized by the anti-vax, anti-sunscreen sort of conspiratorial wellness community that can invalidate what is real as well.
The other thing that makes toxin sometimes verge on like, is it real or is it not real, is that some things really are very potent toxins. So it only takes a tiny little bit to actually be harmful. Whereas other things, consuming excess sugar in very large quantities over a long period of time can be bad for you. But sugar isn't a toxin because it's not something that, you know, even a small amount would hurt you.
Okay. That's an important distinction. The next thought spiral goes like this. Are there more environmental toxins now than in previous pre-industrial revolution eras?
For sure. I mean, yes, both the production of all kinds of things in the post-industrial era those processes, and they're done on such a large scale and involve so many chemical processes that there's a lot of byproducts that are generated and waste that's generated. And also just the increase in the human population, means that there's just more of everything. So for sure, there's more environmental toxins now than there were before.
I like this question because I love to zoom out when I'm like really thought spiraling about something or feeling fatalistic or defeatist about the current moment. I like to get a wider lens to figure out how much of a problem is this compared to concerns that we had to confront 100 years ago, 10,000 years ago. So it sounds like this is a product, of course, that makes sense, of technology having negative side effects, but it's not like before the Industrial Revolution, everybody was living in hunky-dory peace. Like you could die in many other less pleasant ways, probably.
Well, yeah, people died of injuries and infectious diseases and things that our Industrial Revolution and scientific revolution helped us. We were able to overcome some of those things. I mean, to get cancer, you have to, live long enough to get cancer. If you're going to die of a childhood disease, you're not going to be so worried about cancer. And I think to some extent, living longer, absolutely your risk of cancer goes up with every year of life. It's a cost of living. And so, there have been many benefits of the Industrial Revolution. There has been, in terms of public hygiene is so much better. And we have fewer childhood illnesses that result in death in the developed world. And so I think there have been many benefits. But some of those byproducts, the extensive use of plastics and the materials that are used in producing them and the byproducts and waste products and so forth definitely are adding up.
It's so wild to me. The cause and effect of toxins and diseases. I get why people get conspiratorial about it and think that the government is making it up because it sounds fake. I can only imagine how shook the general public was when it was confirmed that germs were real and they caused disease. They're these little invisible things. Didn't you make this point recently where you were like, it does require, for the average person, some amount of religious adjacent faith that you just have to believe that this thing that you can't see unless you have a microscope or access to a microscope, whatever, is real and is causing things to happen in the world, some of which are positive and some of which are negative. That is a mindfuck. Last night, this really goes to show my YouTube algorithm. I was watching a report about the connection between factory chemicals growing up around places like Pittsburgh, where there are a lot of factories, and occurrences of Parkinson's. There's now a segment of the country called the Parkinson's Belt that is associated with communities surrounding those factories and also the central coast of California surrounding all that farmland where pesticides are used widely. And I'm just my instinct when I hear the link between pesticides and Parkinson's is that sounds fake, but it's not, It's such a mindfuck. Which leads me actually to this thought spiral, which feels a little paranoid, but is so relatable. It just says, I'm putting that sigh in there, but I can hear it in the question. Why does everything cause cancer?
Right. Yeah. And fortunately, everything does not cause cancer. So that's the first thing I want to say. It can kind of seem like everything causes cancer because we hear so much reporting about the things that are discovered to cause cancer. And then also, truthfully, biology is complicated. And so many different substances can damage our DNA, which fundamentally is going to be the thing that gets cancer going. And so on the one hand, there are many things that can damage DNA and can ultimately cause cancer, but it's certainly not everything.
Yeah.
And it just feels that way sometimes.
Well, and that can also just be used as a kind of I give up excuse. It's because people say a lot of kind of know-it-all-y, pedantic things oh, you shouldn't have that Diet Coke. Diet Coke causes cancer. And you're well, everything causes cancer. So YOLO,
Yeah.
There's a sense of that.
Well, on that note, I want to say I came across a study just yesterday that reported that actually cell phones do not cause brain cancer. And I was so happy to see that because it's unusual to find a story that's about something that does not cause cancer, first of all. But there was a concern, many years ago raised when cell phones were first starting to become common that maybe the radiation so close to your head, somehow might be causing cancers. But this was a big study commissioned by the World Health Organization, and it went through the literature on like more than 60 different studies that had been done. And they just simply could not find any correlation or any association between how long your phone calls are, how much you're using your cell phone or anything like that, any kind of correlation between that and incidence of either brain tumors or other types of head and neck cancers. So I thought that was good news. See, everything doesn't cause cancer.
Yeah. I mean, God, my cell phone is harming me in more abstract ways. No, but that is encouraging, especially because we have someone in our family who died of brain cancer. And I remember at 12 years old when that happened, there was this sort of hush-hush kind of panicky discussion about whether or not it might have been due to cell phone use. And this was in the early 2000s when it was new that most people had a cell phone. I was a tween girl, so I was like, oh God, is this... I actually remember holding my cell phone really far away from my head for a year.
Maybe that's why everybody shouts into their cell phone when they're speaking in public.
Yeah. I don't know. It could be. People's behaviors. Why? Okay, so let's get into some more specific questions. The next person asks, how much do the PFOA/PFTE cooking products help?
So those are forever chemicals. There's these chemicals. These PFOA, PFTE are things like the coating on Teflon pans. They're nonstick pans. And in terms of how much do they help? Well, they help with having food not stick to the pan. So that's how they're helpful. But the problem is that these products, if they're consumed, can be toxic. So you really don't want to damage your Teflon pans or get flakes of that stuff in your food. And you don't want to superheat those pans because that can release some of the more toxic components that are in those coatings. Or you could give up your Teflon pans altogether and scrub harder.
Okay. This is the trade-off with convenience, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of reminds me of how certain Olympic champions who are going for the gold medal say they would sacrifice 10 years of their life to win gold. It's how much are we willing to risk to have this champion convenient life? Does that make sense? We're trying to move really quickly at a high level through life. And if, in theory, if you don't have to spend 20 minutes a day scrubbing your pan, you could go on to become extraordinary in that time, there's some kind of capitalistic energy underneath all of these super convenient, high-tech, but potentially cancer-causing products.
I was thinking about it last night when I was using my plastic cutting board, and I'm like, those microplastics, where do they come from? When you clean your plastic cutting board, there's going to be microscopic plastic particles that come out and then get in the environment and all of that. And it's but the plastic, it's cleaner, than the wood and cutting boards, which can be porous and the bacteria can accumulate in them. And so it's we think of it as cleaner on the one hand, but then it might be poisoning the environment. And that's definitely a trade-off that you're thinking about. But that sounds like it could turn into an overthinking thought spiral.
Oh, here we go. Totally. Yeah, let me not. Okay, this is not a listener-submitted thought spiral, but I just really need to know. And I probably won't understand it still, no matter how many times I ask. But how do these toxins negatively interact with DNA? What mechanically is going on? What? What? I still can't wrap my head around it.
Okay. Well, I probably can't answer that for this great whole spectrum of toxins that are potentially out there. They don't all act by damaging DNA, although many of them do. So many of certainly the things that cause cancer, I wouldn't speak to Parkinson's. That's probably not a DNA thing. But the things that sounds more like maybe a neurotoxin of some kind that would kill specific types of cells or damage particular types of cells rather than more like something that causes DNA damage. But for some chemicals that cause DNA damage, there are a variety of different ways that can happen. It can interfere directly with the chemistry of how the double helix forms itself. And when it replicates, these chemicals can introduce errors. They can make certain enzymes in your body not work as well. And so there's a variety of different ways, honestly, that toxins, which is like this big catch-all word for anything that does you harm. Like there's a lot of different ways that things that cause you harm can do that. So, I mentioned cyanide. Cyanide is not going to damage DNA. Cyanide like decouples the energy production in your mitochondria. So you just immediately run out of energy and die.
Mighty mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell.
Right. So, for every toxin, there's going to be a different mechanism of action in detail. And so it would be, you'd need an entire class on chemical toxicology to like sort of break down and go through every, how those work.
Okay. Fair enough. I just in my mind, I'm like, I can't see these particles. So I'm like, what does it look like under a microscope when a toxin introduces an error into normal DNA production or normal formation of neurological cells? Like, what does that what does that look like?
It's going to look like chemistry. So it's not going to be something you can see under the microscope. It's going to be at a tinier level than that. Okay. So it's going to be at the level of hydrogen bonds between atoms and molecules and things like that.
How the fuck do people figure this out?
Well, it takes a lot of people and a lot of different disciplines because there are chemists doing all of that level of work, like really trying to understand chemically how the toxin, which is a chemical, interacts with DNA, which is also a chemical, or interacts with the other substances in your body. They're all chemicals, like all the substances in your body.
Yes.
So how these things interact, that's chemistry, right? And so there's a whole field of chemists who are interested in how those chemicals interact with one another and what those chemical reactions actually technically are that cause the kind of damage we're talking about.
Let's get into some more thought spirals. The next one asks, do human bodies produce carcinogens?
I mean, absolutely. So first, let's just say, what's a carcinogen? A carcinogen is anything that causes cancer. Okay, so that's the definition. And so the question is, do our human bodies naturally produce them? And this is absolutely true. And that is one of the reasons why, the risk of getting cancer goes up with every year of life, because just the chemical reactions that are going on inside of our bodies every day so that we can stay alive, some of the byproducts of those are themselves toxic.
So we are like little factories, each of us.
We are. Yes, we are. Every little cell in there. And so some processes that are going on inside of our cells, let's say we're killing a bacterial infection. One cell's killing a bacterial infection. In order to kill the bacteria, the cell has to poison it. And so it makes a little bit of poison. And then maybe if that cell dies, it releases some of those poisons into the body. Or just the act of generating energy that we need to survive. The byproducts of this can be oxygen-free radicals, which are as scary as they sound. They run around and are very reactive chemicals that can do damage to other molecules in the cell. Now, unfortunately, our cells are so smart. They have ways of repairing damage. And also, a cell will just kill itself. It'll commit suicide if it detects a lot of DNA damage.
Is that apoptosis?
Yes, that is. And
I listen sometimes when my parents talk.
You've been listening to that kind of talk since you were over dinner for a long time. But yeah, so we have a lot of protective mechanisms, both within cells and as a collection of cells that the whole body is. We have a lot of protective mechanisms, which is why we don't all get cancer, every day. But the natural processes of just living by themselves do create toxins.
Well, shit. All right.
But it's okay.
Yeah, but it's okay. Because
Right.
to your point, not everybody is getting cancer every second.
Right.
Not everything can work out perfectly. And that's why intelligent design does not exist. Okay. The next thought spiral goes, can anyone actually eliminate exposure to PFAs, or are we all going to be exposed anyways? I'm so impressed with these thought spiralers' mastery of toxic acronyms. What's a PFA?
That's because, the chemical name for that is so long, I couldn't even recite it to you. So it's probably hard to avoid all exposure to these things, which are quite ubiquitous in our world. But there is a website that the Environmental Protection Agency has, which is conveniently enough like www.epa.gov/PFAS. And so you can go there and it tells you some ways that you could reduce your exposure to those particular chemicals.
Oh, God. I know what I'm going to be reading on the plane tomorrow. Okay. You mentioned microplastics earlier. This is definitely a subject that I thought spiral about because Casey just read a whole book about microplastics and was like feeding me the highlights or lowlights, and it was really freaking me out. What are microplastics and how bad are they? Should we be more concerned?
Well, I don't know how concerned you are, so I don't know if you should be more concerned. But honestly, no one really knows just yet how bad they are. And you can imagine where they come from, right? We have so much plastic in the world. And then every piece of plastic that's ever been generated is eventually going to break down into smaller and smaller pieces. And like I said, last night I'm scrubbing the plastic cutting board. And as I'm scrubbing it, like little microscopic pieces of plastic are coming off. I can't see them. I'm unaware of it, but they wash down the drain and then they go into the ocean.
Can someone see them? Like, is there an animal?
Sure, you can see them. Yeah, no, people see them and they count them. People are doing this right now to try to figure out like where, and of course these microplastics or even nanoplastics, so even 1,000 times smaller pieces of plastic, they're kind of everywhere, including sometimes even in fresh fruits and vegetables because cells take them up. And so they're everywhere. So should we be worried about them? I mean, instinctively, intuitively, you think probably, yeah, because, I don't really want to eat a plastic bag, right? That doesn't seem like it would be good for me. And I don't. And so I probably don't want to be eating it like a little tiny bit at a time either, right? I mean, I think we should probably be concerned. Though it's really not clear if the plastic itself, because plastic is a pretty inert substance, which is why it lasts forever, which is why you can't get rid of it, and which is why it's so useful. So is the plastic itself harmful? But one of the problems is because it's a water-hating substance, like it's waterproof, that makes it attractive for oily, greasy these oily, greasy things that can slide into your cells and stuff. So
whoa.
One reason we worry about microplastics is because now these other toxins can adhere to them, stick to them, and then come along for the ride. So if your cell takes up the little plastic particle, it's taking up that toxin along with it. So that's one of the concerns around microplastics.
Why do you think human beings fuck around and find out in this way? Like, are we just, as a species, so progress obsessed? But we weren't for the longest time. Why in the past 300 years have we become so obsessed with exponential progress and a new paradigm shift in technology every fucking 5 minutes that we don't stop? I guess with AI, this is the whole conversation. We're stopping to consider what the worst of it might be. But that's a new conversation. Why were we just out here fucking around with plastic?
Well, consider that the human lifespan has actually extended substantially every decade, during this period.
Yeah, plastic's really good.
So, yeah, I don't know that plastic is the reason for
Think
that.
of the medical devices that you can make with plastic.
Right. And you can sterilize it and all of that. And so, yes, right. So I wouldn't attribute all of that to plastic, but I would say that some of, a lot of the advances that have come along with these things have allowed us to live longer and healthier lives. And so that's why we're kind of addicted to that increase in technology and medical advances and everything, because we like living longer. And then they go and damage our DNA, and we're taking a hit for that later on. But
how long do you want to live?
How
do you
long
have an age in
do
mind?
I want to live? That's an interesting
I'm personally
question.
invested in your answer.
I told you, I'm worth more to you alive.
Oh my God.
Well, let's see. It depends if my cohort gets to live with me, I don't want to outlive my friends and my family, because then I'd have to make new friends. That's so hard.
Relatable for all the introverts listening. I don't want to live longer than my friends because then I'd have to make new friends. LOL. I've never
never thought of it that way.
I've never thought of it that way either. But if everybody's living that long, then I do feel like, so I teach a lecture on aging. I mostly teach a class about developmental biology, like how we build ourselves from a single cell. But I have one lecture that's really about kind of aging. And when I first started teaching it, I would ask the class, what are the advantages of, like, if we could extend lifespan, like, should we really do that?
Yeah.
Is that a good idea or is that a bad idea? And my own opinion at that time, the first time I posed the question was, well, this sounds like a terrible idea because we're just going to have too many people and too much waste and more toxins and like whatever, and this is going to be really bad.
And now that you're 62, you're
Yes.
like, I actually like this idea.
But then I kept getting older and older, and the idea started sounding better. And the rationale I came up with for that is honestly that I personally get better at what I'm doing like every single year. And what I do is pretty hard, and I've been getting better at it. And if I could live twice as long, and I'm extrapolating not just from me, but to like everybody who's working in some kind of challenging area, that we really might be able to solve some of the problems we've created.
Because wisdom.
Right. Because of all that wisdom that we're gaining, which can also be nonlinear. Like that can turn into something exponential if like in two different areas you come up with like a solution to energy by nuclear fusion or something.
Okay, so are you going to get like blood platelets from me to live longer like Brian Johnson?
I'm not going to do the vampire thing.
Okay.
No, not going there.
Okay, so you just want to grow up to be like Gandalf the Grey and like so wise and
Oh, I like that. I like
yeah,
that. Yeah.
I see that for you.
Okay.
Okay. This conversation is meandering and chaotic in a way that I think is perfect, actually, for this particular podcast. I actually forgot we were recording for a while. Next thought spiral. Can you even really say that this or that toxin caused your cancer? And this was signed a current cancer patient.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question. And the answer is usually you can't really tell exactly how or why a particular person got a particular cancer. But there are a couple of really interesting exceptions to that. Because mutations are random things that happen. Yes, some kind of toxin might increase the probability of that mutation happening, but did that toxin actually cause your cancer? There are some cases where you can pin it more precisely on a particular exposure. And what I'm thinking of specifically are, asbestos exposure causing mesothelioma. That seems to be a pretty clear thing because mesothelioma is this really rare cancer. So that's one of the things that makes it easier to pinpoint. And most people who get it have had an asbestos exposure. That's a case where you can do it. You can kind of say that it's very likely. You'll never say with certainty. And then another case that's in a more common cancer like lung cancer, which is one of the most common cancers.
It's one of the most common cancers?
Yeah. Lung cancer is really common. Oh. And lung cancer, the majority of cases can be attributed to smoking. Now, if a smoker gets lung cancer, can you say that this person who smokes got cancer because they smoked? Or randomly, sometimes a smoker might get cancer and without it being attributable to the smoke. But it turns out that the chemicals in smoke actually induce specific types of mutations. There's a sort of mutational signature that you can find in the DNA of the tumor cells that says this was a result of smoke. Okay?
Like Kissin' Kate Barlow or like a murderer who has
leaves
like
a
a trademark
signature
on each of their victims.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's an interesting analogy. And it is a murderer. So with smoking, there is a signature in the cancer that you can detect. And the other one is with exposure to ultraviolet light from the sun in skin cancers. Like you can see the types of changes to the DNA that occur because of ultraviolet light exposure are different than the types of DNA changes that you get from other damaging agents. And so sometimes you can more precisely pinpoint the culprit, but usually really not. For an individual who gets cancer, like when I had lymphoma when I was 41, we don't know how that happened, and we don't know if it was just bad luck, which is, like I said, every cell, every time it divides, and billions of cells divide every day in your body. Every time they divide, there is a couple of errors in copying the 6 billion letters of DNA that have to be copied every time you make a new cell. Okay, so you've got billions of letters that have to be copied perfectly, and then you have billions of cells doing that. I mean, every day mutations are happening without any particular environment. So most of those mutations are harmless, and most of them, the cells come and go and we never know it and it's fine, and we have repair mechanisms, we have this and we have that. So most of the time it's okay. But you can, just by bad luck, have one of the cancer-causing mutations arise, just by chance. So that is something that can happen. Or you can make the chance of that happening higher if you really expose yourself to lots of things that damage DNA. So, but any individual person, sometimes it's a mystery.
Yeah, I think probably one of the reasons why we're doing this episode, one of the reasons why toxins are such a hot button topic and why there are so many products being marketed as non-toxic and can help you prevent disease and cancer, whatever, is precisely because we don't want to accept that there's so much randomness going on. One of the reasons why there is so much misunderstanding, confusion, panic, overthinking regarding this topic is because underlying it are a lot of unknowns. We as a human species do not care for unknowns. The market knows that. And there are some, I think, really sincere motives to want to help people diminish their chances of getting a certain disease, including cancer. But there's also the motivation to want to make promises that you really can't fulfill and that a scientist wouldn't necessarily. Scientists equivocate in their language in pursuit of precision in a way that people immediately filter through their confirmation bias. And so it's oh, you're saying that this is not very likely to do this. Okay, it never will. Or this is likely to do this, then it will absolutely work, And so that, I think, is one of the reasons why there are so many thought spirals surrounding this topic.
On that note, we do like to have agency, and I think there are some things that we can do to lower our chances. So at the same time that every time a cell divides, there's some chance a mutation will happen, and there's literally nothing you can do about that, there are actionable things that you can do, right? And so because the professional estimators out there are estimating that up to 50% of cancers are likely preventable by taking a handful of specific actions, okay? So if you think about that for a minute, that's really interesting because it means there's 5 things you can do that are the big picture things. And then there's a million things you could worry about that would account for the rest. But then stick to the big 5.
Okay, what are the big 5? Hit us with the big 5.
So the big 5 are, number 1, don't smoke. That's it. Smoking causes cancer. And it's the number 1 thing that you can do. If you already don't smoke, great. Reduce or eliminate alcohol intake. Alcohol is a carcinogen. This is known. I would put drinking alcohol as somewhere between smoking, and it's not as bad as smoking, but it's worse than eating cured meats, processed red meat.
What about psilocybin?
I'm not aware of any studies that have been done, but my guess would be that it's consumed in such small amounts that it would be hard for me to imagine that it would be cancer causing.
That's great news. But you love champagne, so what are you doing about that?
Yeah, I do. And, but in thinking about this, I think the quantity definitely matters. So a glass of champagne to celebrate, a special occasion is probably going to stay on my list, but it doesn't have to stay on everybody's list. Just have to make some conscious choices. You could live longer and have life not be worth living.
For sure.
So,
okay. Booze, smoking, what's next?
Maintain a healthy weight, whatever that might mean for you and your body. Obesity is a risk factor for many different types of cancer. And then some that are less obvious in that you don't hear every single day, getting vaccinated for HPV, human papillomavirus. So human papillomavirus causes most cervical cancers. And getting vaccinated in a timely manner and preventing HPV infection prevents cancer. So that's an actionable item. Mm-hmm. Protecting yourself from UV light. Everybody is aware, if you don't like chemical sunscreens, which in my opinion are just fine, you can wear a hat, cover yourself with light clothing, but protecting yourself from UV light, we know exactly how UV light damages DNA and causes skin cancer. So we're not going to smoke. We're going to reduce or eliminate alcohol intake, maintain a healthy weight, get vaccinated, protect ourselves from UV light. And then, of course, avoid asbestos exposure, which honestly, very few of us have a lot of control. But there are government regulations. You can sort of support the idea of government regulations around exposures to harmful things like that. And so this is more than 5. But then there's also, I would say, you can avoid sources of radiation like radon gas. Okay, so radon is a naturally occurring radiation that happens from rocks and in the environment. And some homes have higher levels of radon than others. And there's a EPA standard for what's an acceptable level of radon gas. But exposure to radon gas can cause lung cancer. This is known. And I don't know if you remember, in our house in Baltimore, we had a little fan in the basement because there was radon in the rock under the house. And you get a fan installed to remove the radon gas from the house.
They had to disclose that when you bought it?
We specifically asked for a test at that
How'd you
time.
learn about radon?
From one of my colleagues,
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Inside secret information.
Yes, it shouldn't really be secret. It's definitely, but it's not as
Shout it
well
from
known.
the rooftops. Get your houses checked for radon.
Yeah, your
gas.
house. We got our house here in Santa Barbara. We got our house checked for radon, and we did not need any kind of remediation. But the remediation is simple. It's just installing a particular kind of fan that will remove the radon before it gets into your home. The last thing I was going to say is just cancer screenings. So mammograms and colonoscopies. Colonoscopies are not fun, but they are really a great test, not only because colon cancers often grow slowly, so you can catch them at an early stage. And the test itself, the colonoscopy, can remove the early stage thing before. So it's actually a prevention in addition to a diagnostic. So it's very powerful.
Colonoscopies come up on this show not infrequently. And while I know the prep is unpleasant, I hear gorgeous things about the drugs you get. So I'm personally looking forward to my day.
More than one reason to go for the colonoscopy.
Okay, but wait. The thing about the radon gas inspired me to want to ask another thought spiral that was submitted by a listener, which was does someone secretly have all the answers here and they're hiding them from us? Because that's an example of an answer or a piece of really valuable, potentially life-saving information. Are there public health announcements about radon? I haven't heard any. Is there information about toxins that is somehow being camouflaged by some kind of elite institution?
I don't think there's a cabal out there that's trying to make sure you don't find out about radon gas, but I think the thing about radon gas is it's not causing cancer nearly to the same extent that smoking is. Okay, so it is causing lung cancer, but a smaller number of them. It's also not every location has a problem with radon gas, so it's maybe not as universal. And so you can go look up a map of whether your area is, likely to have problems with radon gas and that you should really get your home tested. So it may be something that's more spread among, I don't know if realtors know about it or in their particular area where they work. But yeah, I distinctly remember hearing about it for the first time and be like, really? It's there's gas in the air that's
don't these things
radioactive?
Sound made up? They sound made up.
I do agree with that because I remember reacting that way. But of course, now we have the internet and we can go find these things out. And so, yeah.
Okay, so this was not a thought spiral that was submitted by a listener, but I'm desperate to ask it because I read an NPR piece titled "Some TikTok Influencers Are Maligning Sunscreen. Here's what to know about the claims." And I'll link it in our show notes. But I learned in this piece that one survey from an organization called the Orlando Health Cancer Institute found that 1 in 7 American adults believe that using sunscreen daily is more harmful than direct sun exposure. And not just chemical sunscreen. I have concerns about chemical sunscreen. They're illegal in some places because they poison the water and they're dangerous to fish. And I'm okay, well, I'm not that different than a fish. I don't want that shit on me either. And the mineral sunscreen is more annoying because it leaves a white cast on your face, blah, 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 whatever. That's a sacrifice that I'm willing to make to use the zinc oxide or whatever. But I think some of these TikTok influencers have just like flattened the nuance about sunscreen. And there are really prominent anti-sunscreen celebrities, like reality TV show stars who have big platforms. Like Kristen Cavallari is one of them. She comes up on this podcast all the time. She was a Laguna Beach person. Remember when I used to watch that? Speaking of toxic. But yeah, so like she perpetuates anti-sunscreen rhetoric. Anyway, the sunscreen conversation is just like confounding to me, and I want to understand it. Why are anti-vax and anti-sunscreen communities rising?
There are two different types of sunscreen, right? There's chemical sunscreen and mineral sunscreen. And the chemical sunscreens, what they do is that they absorb the UV light before it gets to your skin. And the mineral sunscreens, I think, just block it. Like they just literally like keep, prevent it from getting there. So I could imagine someone thinking, I would prefer to use a mineral sunscreen over a chemical sunscreen so that I'm limiting the number of different, chemicals that I don't really know that much about and limiting my exposure to them. Like I could see that as being
Me too.
A rational way to go, or I'm going to wear my linen shirt instead.
I'm pretty sure that anti-sunscreen people like don't believe in sunscreen of any kind.
Okay, this brings up an incredibly important point that I'd love to make, which is that it's so important what source of information you trust. Right? I mean, it all comes down to that. We could talk ourselves blue in the face about specific examples of toxins and whether they really cause cancer or not. I could share all kinds of facts about this. But really, for your listeners, the most important thing is to decide what source of information about this sort of thing are you going to trust? And so I can tell you what sources of information I trust and why I trust them, And I really think this is an important message. So if I want to know something about a health concern or, if a particular chemical is harmful, the kind of sources I tend to go to are the Cleveland Clinic website, the Mayo Clinic website, the Johns Hopkins newsletter, the Harvard Medical School newsletter, MD Anderson Cancer Center.
You mean you're not getting your information from TikTok influencers?
Not so much. And the reason is that I would look at what the incentive structures are for these different sources of information. Mm-hmm. And for a TikTok influencer, their incentive is to get as many views as possible, which is not giving them the incentive. Accuracy of the information isn't as important for them as getting lots of views. And the more we know, the more sensational the claim is, then the more, views you're going to get. So their motivation, their incentive structure isn't such that that would make them a reliable source for me. Whereas these institutions that I just mentioned, like their reputation depends on them giving accurate information. Mm-hmm. So for me, the incentive structure is there. The National Academy of Sciences, or, there's a lot of organizations where the incentive is for them to give accurate information. It's their brand, it's their identity. And I think of how tarnished it can get if they make even a small mistake. So I go there. But then, of course, those are just general places. Sometimes I'll dig into the primary, like scientific papers that support a point of view. But it's also nice to have a person, right, that you can go to that you trust. And we can't read everything on every subject. Like I cannot become an instant expert on every subject. I mean, it's easier now than it used to be, but you can't. So it's nice to have a person who makes it their business to go to the conferences and read and digest all of this material, and then you can go to them. And so, in talking about the kind of things we're talking about today, I actually went to an oncologist that I know, and I asked him, I said, what do you tell your patients when they ask you, what kind of toxins should I avoid, or what caused my cancer, or whatever? And then I went and looked at these different sources that I trust, and they all said the same thing.
So would you endorse someone like when they go in for, a physical, or when they go into their GP's office, would you endorse like asking them just almost basic science, curiosity motivated questions? Like you can just like ask your doctor?
It depends a little bit on the doctor. So you have to know your doctor, and you have to know how deeply they're knowledgeable about things. And so you can ask some questions, and you'll find out pretty quickly based on the answers if your doctor is deeply knowledgeable about something or not. And hopefully if they're not, they say they don't know. I don't know if I don't know if they're trained that way.
I'm just trying to think of how someone would find that personal source.
I know. But your personal doctor could be a good source of information. They went to medical school. They hopefully, when I interviewed my doctor, I asked him, how do you keep up to date on the medical literature? Because it's vast and, changing all the time. And I wanted to know, was he just going to sit on what he learned in medical school for the rest of his life? Or was he going to take an active role in kind of a continuing education? And it was great. He's like, oh, yeah, I listen to medical podcasts and I go to conferences and
Grill your doctors, folks. Grill your doctors. Okay, let's phrase the next few closing thought spirals as like a lightning round.
Oh.
Do you think you can?
Maybe, sure.
Okay, let's try it. This person asks, how worried should I be about eating organic versus non-organic foods?
So there's an organization called the Environmental Working Group that is a nonprofit, nonpartisan group that came up with a list of a dozen fruits and vegetables that are called the Dirty Dozen because when the EPA and the FDA tested them for pesticide residue, they found that they had high levels of pesticide residue on them. So you can go look up the Dirty Dozen, and there's things I eat every day on there, like strawberries, blueberries, things you'd like an excuse not to eat, like kale.
Oh, there's also a clean 15.
There's a clean 15. Exactly. So we don't want to just say what you shouldn't do, but what. So the idea is organically grown fruits and vegetables, they're not supposed to use pesticides when they're growing them. So if you're going to want to eat a lot of strawberries and blueberries and the things on the Dirty Dozen list, maybe you want to buy those organic. But the ones on the Clean 15, maybe, since they don't have as much pesticide residue on them or they come out as clean, then you should feel free not to buy organic. And then there were a bunch that were in the middle.
Wait, what's on the Clean 15? Avocados. Which I learned from Lord and Savior Gwyneth Paltrow that you don't need to buy avocados organic.
Oh, there you go.
Not a great source of wellness information in general.
But she got that one right.
She got that
and
one right.
And maybe she knew about this list.
A broken clock is right twice a day, okay? That's how you should treat Gwyneth Paltrow. All right. Sweet corn, pineapple, onions, papaya, sweet peas, frozen, asparagus, honeydew melon, kiwi cabbage, mushrooms, mangoes, watermelon, and carrots. I don't eat any of this bullshit.
Mm-hmm. Well, those are the ones that you should feel confident that you could buy and not pay the extra for the organic version of them.
Okay.
Whereas on the Dirty Dozen, which are the things I do eat every day, you really should probably, if you can afford it, buy the organic. And that's the problem. Like the organically grown things are more expensive.
There was a question about hyper-processed foods.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do about those?
Yeah, I think the question was something like, why are they bad and how do we know which ones and so on? And I think as a general rule, the way to think about it is that every step of processing of the food has a chance to remove something nutritious and beneficial and potentially add something that would be harmful. So let's take as an example like refined white flour. Right? You start with whole wheat flour, you've got the nutritional benefit of the fiber and everything that's in the whole grain. You remove that so that it's not brown anymore or whatever. And now you've removed a nutrient. And now you bleach it. So you expose it to a chemical. So now you've added a chemical residue to the thing and you've taken away the nutrient value. So you've turned something good into something less good. And I think the idea behind processed and then hyper-processed foods is that every step of processing has the potential to remove something beneficial and add something harmful. And so we just want to avoid that.
I learned recently because Casey watched a news broadcast about this. So I'm relaying this information basically third hand. Take it with a grain of salt. Again, he's consuming things and giving me the highlights. The most sort of quote-unquote toxic processed foods are sugary drinks, sugary sodas, and the second worst was hyper-processed deli meats, bacon, bologna, etc.
Yeah, those have definitely been associated with colon cancer, the processed meats.
Yee! Let's do one more. This thought spiral asks, what's an alarming toxin you've researched? Mine, from harm reduction, is synthetic marijuanas.
Well, I wouldn't say I've deeply researched this, but I did come across an article yesterday that there's a lawsuit that's been filed against Walgreens drugstores for not disclosing that their generic version of Mucinex might have been contaminated, allegedly was contaminated with benzene. And benzene is a chemical that we know causes cancer. So I don't know how valid that claim is, but that's the kind of thing you definitely could go down a thought spiral on, and when you're saying, is there somebody who's keeping secrets from me? I wouldn't look so much at the government. I would look at like commercial entities that stand to make a profit.
Hear, hear.
And that is, something to think about with generic medicines. So generic medicines, the active ingredient is identical, whether it's generic or brand name, but the formulation, everything else that's in that pill can be different. And some people think that, you're better off with the brand name drug because you don't worry about this kind of like what else is in that.
Oh, you get the name brand?
Yeah.
Oh, shit. That is so backwards because in my mind, I'm like, oh, the name brand is trying to scam me.
Yeah.
But you're saying that like,
all I can say is I know that the rule is that the active ingredient will be the same, but the inactive ingredients can be different. And I don't know when people are trying to cut costs, if sometimes,
That makes a lot of sense. I can get a little conspiratorial with the medical stuff. You know about me, I don't like doctors. Yeah. I think removing wisdom teeth is a scam. I'm like a tinfoil hat.
I told you that.
Oh, you told me that. So then it is a scam. They keep trying to remove my wisdom teeth. I'm like, what? You're going to come for my tonsils and my appendix next?
So I wouldn't say that all oral surgeons are scammers, but I would say that it's definitely in their financial interest to remove more wisdom teeth. So that's always got to raise a flag, like sort of right away. And then I would say it developed as a conventional wisdom, so to speak, in that area. Like I remember doctors that I respected thinking that you should get your wisdom teeth removed when you're young so that the healing process is easier. And under certain circumstances, that may be true. If they're causing you trouble, it is probably better to remove them when you're younger. But if they're not causing you trouble, and I still have two of mine that are not causing me any trouble, and unnecessary medical procedures.
We have a lot of evolutionarily obsolete body parts that we could remove but that don't cause us any trouble. Those are called spandrels, by the way, fun fact, when we have a sort of out-of-date body part that like developed for some adaptive reason and now isn't useful anymore. It's called a spandrel.
I learned.
The human chin is one example. What is a chin for? You don't need a chin. They look nice, though. Ding. Okay. Mom. Denise, Dr. Montell, thank you so much for joining me for this overthinky, but ultimately like pretty illuminating, and I would dare to say even soothing conversation about toxins. My final question for you is, what is the one thing you think, generally speaking, folks are overthinking the most regarding toxins? And what is the one thing you think we're underthinking the most?
Yeah. So overthinking, I would say maybe it's paying attention to the million things that might be having a very small effect and like getting overwhelmed by how many different toxins there might be in the environment rather than really focusing on those few big things that could make a big difference. I think it's just much more manageable if you can think of a few big things you can do and not think of a million little things that you need to do. And then underthinking, I think it's this really consciously deciding what sources of information you're going to go to and why you're going to go to them and why you're going to trust them. And those sources of information can be websites and institutions, or they can be people, but you're going to, really think about why you're trusting particular piece of information. I think that's actually the most important thing.
Thank you for sharing that.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
And thank all of you so much for listening to this episode of Magical Overthinkers. Now's the time in the episode where I want to share a little tidbit of evidence-based advice for how we overthinkers can get out of our own heads this week. This one has to do with a technique from cognitive behavioral therapy that's sometimes referred to as decatastrophizing, or the what-if technique. It's a method of CBT that assists people in confronting their worst case scenarios. You know when you start to worry about a problem and you take it way too far, where you're jumping ahead 2, 3, 5, 10, 1,000 steps to how something as small as a mean internet comment or an ambiguous text from your mother-in-law could somehow lead to your life being completely destroyed. The decatastrophizing what-if technique is supposed to help you logically work through the realities of the problem that you're dealing with and sort of inoculate yourself against the fear of those worst-case scenarios. I found a decatastrophizing worksheet on therapistaid.com, which is a resource for mental health professionals. I will link it in our show notes. And the worksheet invites the participant to answer a sequence of questions. First of all, what are you worried about? Second of all, how likely is it that your worry will come true? Provide examples. Third of all, if your worry does come true, what's the worst that could happen? And why is that bad? Truly, deeply, foundationally, existentially, why is that so bad? And then it asks you to answer the question, if your worry does come true, what's most likely to happen? A simpler way of putting this might be to think of the absolute worst possible outcome of the thing that's perturbing you, and to ask almost in the way that a child would ask, why is the sky blue? And you give an answer. And then they ask, why? And why is that? Why is that? Similar to that, you would ask yourself, if that worst case scenario really were to come to pass, why is that bad? Because XYZ. And why is that bad? Because XYZ. And at the end of that, you might end up with an answer that you can actually deal with or wrap your head around. Again, I will link that worksheet in our show notes in case this little tidbit resonated with you. And with that, thanks again for listening. We'll be back with another episode in 2 weeks. And until the next thought spiral, remember, think it over. Just don't overthink it. Magical Overthinkers was created and hosted by Amanda Montell and edited by Jordan Moore of The Pod Cabin. Our theme music is by Casey Kolb. Thank you to our magical manager, Katie Epperson, coordinator, Reese Oliver, and Network Studio 71. Be sure to follow the pod on Instagram at Magical Overthinkers. We're also on YouTube, link in show notes, and ad-free episodes as well as behind-the-scenes extras are available on the Magical Overthinkers Substack at amandamontell.substack.com.